On November 12, 1942, at 10:47 in the morning, a 28-year-old welder named Margaret Hayes stood in the rain at the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, holding a welding torch that was still hot enough to burn through steel, watching a ship she had started working on exactly 4 days and 15 hours ago slide down the ways into San Francisco Bay. The ship was 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, weighed 14,245 tons fully loaded, and Margaret had personally welded 847 seams on its hull in those 4 days. Her supervisor had told her it was impossible. The naval architect from Washington had called the whole project a fantasy. The British Admiralty representative who visited the yard in September said the Americans were lying about their production numbers. But Margaret Hayes was standing there in the rain, watching the SS Robert E. Peary, a fully functional Liberty ship, enter the water exactly 4 days and 15 hours after the first steel plate had been laid on the slipway. 4,500 workers had built an entire ocean-going cargo vessel in less time than it took most people to drive across the country. Margaret was 28 years old, former schoolteacher from Iowa, had never seen a welding torch until 8 months ago, never worked in a shipyard, never built anything larger than a bookshelf, but she had just helped build a ship that would carry 10,800 tons of cargo and 71 men across an ocean where German submarines were sinking 3 Allied vessels every single day. The United States was 7 months into a war it was losing badly. German U-boats had sunk 681 Allied ships in 1942 alone. The British merchant fleet was being destroyed faster than Britain could replace it. Every military planner in Washington understood the mathematics. If American shipyards could not build cargo vessels faster than Germany could sink them, the Allies would lose the war. Not might lose, would lose. Britain would starve. The Soviet Union would collapse. American troops would have no way to reach Europe or the Pacific. The war would be over before it really began. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, American shipyards built 112 merchant ships total. That same year, Germany sank over 1,000 Allied vessels. The British were building ships using traditional methods: riveted construction, skilled craftsmen, 9 to 12 months per vessel. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. At the current construction rate, the Allies would run out of ships by mid-1943. President Roosevelt called a meeting in January 1942 and told his advisers he wanted 8 million tons of new shipping by the end of the year. The admirals looked at him like he had lost his mind. 8 million tons meant roughly 1,600 cargo ships. American yards had never built more than 200 ships in a single year. Roosevelt did not care about historical precedent. He wanted ships, and he wanted them fast. The contract went to a consortium of shipbuilders led by a man named Henry Kaiser. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He was a construction magnate who had built dams and highways. He had never built a ship in his life. The Navy brass hated him. The maritime unions hated him. The established shipyards on the East Coast considered him a fraud. Kaiser did not care. He understood something that traditional shipbuilders did not understand. The problem was not building ships. The problem was building ships the old way. For 300 years, ships had been constructed by skilled craftsmen using riveted steel plates. Riveters were artists. It took years to train a good riveter. Each rivet had to be heated to exactly the right temperature, inserted into a pre-drilled hole, and hammered into place by a 2-man team working in perfect synchronization. A skilled riveting crew could install maybe 400 rivets in a 10-hour shift. A Liberty ship required over 250,000 rivets. The mathematics meant months of work. Kaiser threw out riveting. His ships would be welded. Welding was faster, stronger, required less skill, and could be taught to someone in a matter of weeks instead of years. The old shipbuilders said welded ships would crack and sink. The Navy said welded hulls were untested and dangerous. Kaiser started welding anyway. He also threw out another sacred principle of shipbuilding. Traditional yards built ships from the keel up, one section at a time, in a sequential process. Each phase had to be completed before the next could begin. Kaiser decided to build ships the way Ford built cars. Prefabrication and assembly line production. His shipyards would construct entire sections of the ship simultaneously in different parts of the yard, then bring those sections to the slipway and weld them together like giant Lego blocks. Bow sections built in one area, stern sections in another, deck sections in a third location, all happening at the same time. The naval architect said it would never work. Ships were not cars. The tolerances were too tight, the stresses too complex, the variables too numerous. Kaiser hired 90,000 workers and started building anyway. Margaret Hayes was one of those 90,000 workers. She arrived at Richmond in March 1942, one of 140 women in a training class of 800 people. The instructor was a welder from the Kaiser Dam projects. He spent 1 week teaching them basic welding technique, how to strike an arc, how to maintain the right distance between torch and metal, how to move at a consistent speed, how to recognize a good weld from a bad one. After 1 week, Margaret was assigned to a crew working on hull plates. Her job was to weld steel plates together to form the outer skin of a ship. Each plate was 30 feet long, 8 feet wide, and weighed 3 tons. The plates arrived at her station pre-cut and pre-positioned. Margaret's job was to run a continuous weld along the seam where 2 plates met. The weld had to be perfect. Any gap, any weakness, any flaw would become a point of failure when the ship was loaded with 10,000 tons of cargo and thrown into a North Atlantic storm. If Margaret's weld failed, the ship could break in half, and 71 men would drown in water cold enough to kill them in 4 minutes. No pressure. Margaret was terrified for the first month. She had nightmares about ships cracking apart because of welds she had made. She checked and rechecked every seam. Her supervisor told her to speed up. They were not building jewelry. They were building ships, and they needed them yesterday. By June, Margaret could weld a 30-foot seam in 14 minutes. By August, she could do it in 11 minutes. By October, she could do it in 9 minutes without thinking, her hands moving automatically. The torch an extension of her body. She stopped having nightmares. The ships did not crack. They floated. They carried cargo. They survived storms and torpedoes and years of hard use. Margaret's welds held. The Richmond shipyard had 7 slipways. Each slipway could hold 1 ship under construction. Traditional thinking said 7 slipways meant 7 ships at a time, sequential production. Kaiser said 7 slipways meant 7 ships every 2 weeks. The first Liberty ship built at Richmond took 244 days from keel laying to launch. The second took 182 days. The third took 129 days. The fourth took 92 days. The pattern continued. Every ship was faster than the last. Kaiser's assembly line method was working. Workers were learning. Processes were being refined. Bottlenecks were being eliminated. By September 1942, Richmond was launching a new Liberty ship every 24 days. That was already 3 times faster than traditional shipyards. But it was not fast enough. Roosevelt wanted more ships. The U-boats were still winning. In October 1942, Germany sank 94 Allied ships. That month, American yards delivered 71 new vessels. Still losing. Kaiser called a meeting with his yard supervisors and asked a simple question. What is the absolute minimum time required to build a Liberty ship if everything goes perfectly? The supervisors calculated. If all the prefabricated sections were ready, if all the workers were in place, if there were no delays, no mistakes, no problems, if the weather cooperated and nothing went wrong, the theoretical minimum was maybe 10 days. Kaiser said they were going to do it in 5 days. The supervisors thought he was insane. Building a ship in 5 days was not just difficult. It was physically impossible. There were too many steps, too many welds, too many systems to install. Even with prefabrication, even with unlimited workers, even with perfect coordination, 5 days was fantasy. Kaiser did not care. He announced publicly that Richmond Shipyard No. 2 would build a Liberty ship in 1 week. He invited the press. He invited military observers. He invited the British Admiralty. He was going to prove American industrial capacity was unlimited. If America could build a ship in a week, Germany had already lost the war. They just did not know it yet. The ship would be called the SS Robert E. Peary. Construction would begin on November 8, 1942. Launch would be November 12th. 4 days, not 5, 4. Margaret Hayes was assigned to the Peary project along with 4,499 other workers. The entire yard was reorganized around this single ship. Every prefabrication shop was tasked with producing Peary sections. Every crane was scheduled for Peary lifts. Every supervisor was focused on Peary timelines. The yard operated 24 hours a day in 3 shifts. Margaret worked the day shift, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. But for the Peary, workers were told to stay as long as necessary. Time and a half overtime, double time after 12 hours. Triple time after 16 hours. Some workers stayed on site for 30 hours straight, welding until they physically could not hold the torch anymore, then sleeping for 4 hours and coming back. On November 8th at 12:01 a.m., the first keel plate was lowered onto slipway number 2. Margaret was there. She welded the first seam at 12:17 a.m. The ship was a chaos of coordinated motion. Cranes moving constantly, lifting hull sections that weighed 40 tons each and positioning them with inch-perfect accuracy. Welding crews swarming over every seam the moment 2 sections were joined. Electricians running cable, plumbers installing pipe, carpenters building interior structures, all happening simultaneously in a choreographed dance of industrial violence. The noise was unbelievable. 50 welding torches running at once, metal grinding against metal, rivet guns still being used for certain non-structural connections, cranes groaning under load, supervisors shouting instructions, the constant hiss and crackle of electric arc welding. Margaret worked in a space so loud she could not hear her own thoughts. By the end of the first day, the bottom of the hull was complete. By the end of the second day, the sides were up and the deck was being installed. By the end of the third day, the superstructure was in place and the engine was being lowered into the engine room. On the 4th day, they were installing the masts and finishing the interior spaces. Margaret welded for 19 hours on the 4th day. She started at 6 a.m. and did not stop until 1 a.m. the following morning. Her arms were shaking. Her hands were blistered inside her gloves. She could barely see straight. But the ship was nearly finished. On November 12th at 10:00 a.m., 4 days and 10 hours after the first keel plate was laid, the SS Robert E. Peary was complete. Every weld inspected, every system tested. The ship was ready to launch. At 10:47 a.m., they cut the restraining cables and the Peary slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. A complete oceangoing cargo vessel. Margaret Hayes stood in the rain with 4,499 other workers and watched the impossible become real. If you want to know how the United States built 2,700 Liberty ships while Japan managed only 700, and how women like Margaret Hayes won the industrial war that made victory possible, hit that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm to share this story with more people. These women have been forgotten for 80 years. Let's make sure their story does not disappear. And subscribe, because we are bringing you forgotten history every single day. Back to Margaret and the shipyards that changed the war. The Peary was a publicity stunt. but it was also a statement of capability. If an American shipyard could build a functional ship in 4 days under ideal conditions, then building one every 2 weeks under normal conditions was easy. And that is exactly what happened. After the Peary, Richmond Shipyard No. 2 settled into a production rhythm of 1 Liberty ship every 14 days. The other 6 slipways at Richmond maintained similar rates. 7 slipways, 1 ship every 2 weeks each, meant Richmond alone was launching 3 to 4 ships per week. And Richmond was just one of 18 Kaiser shipyards. Kaiser had yards in Richmond, Oakland, and Los Angeles in California. He had yards in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. Each yard had multiple slipways. Each slipway was launching ships every 2 weeks. But Kaiser was not the only builder. The United States had shipyards in Maine, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama. By the end of 1942, there were 171 shipyards building Liberty ships, tankers, Victory ships, escort carriers, destroyer escorts, landing craft, and hundreds of other vessel types. The scale was beyond anything the world had ever seen. In 1941, American shipyards launched 112 merchant ships. In 1942, they launched 746 ships. In 1943, they launched 1,949 ships. In 1944, they launched 2,247 ships. In 3 years, the United States built more merchant shipping tonnage than the entire rest of the world combined had built in the previous decade. Japan never understood what hit them. In 1941, Japan had the 3rd largest merchant fleet in the world. Approximately 6 million tons of shipping. Japanese war planners calculated they needed 3 million tons of shipping to supply their military operations in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. That left 3 million tons for civilian economy. Tight, but workable. The plan assumed Japan could build approximately 600,000 tons of new shipping per year and would lose maybe 800,000 tons per year to American submarines and air attacks. The net loss of 200,000 tons per year was acceptable. The war would be over before shipping became a critical problem. The Japanese calculations were reasonable based on historical data. In World War I, German submarines sank roughly 1 million tons of Allied shipping per year. Japan assumed American submarines would achieve similar results. They were wrong. American submarines in World War II sank Japanese merchant ships at a rate 50% higher than German U-boats had achieved in World War I. By 1943, American subs were sinking over 1 million tons of Japanese shipping per year. By 1944, that number reached 2 million tons per year. But the real problem was not the rate of sinking. The real problem was the rate of replacement. Japan had promised to build 600,000 tons of new shipping per year. In 1942, Japanese shipyards delivered 260,000 tons. In 1943, they delivered 769,000 tons. In 1944, they delivered 1.7 million tons. On paper, Japan was massively increasing production. In 1944, they actually exceeded their original target by nearly 3 times. But it did not matter. American submarines sank 2 million tons that same year. Japan was losing the race. The reason was simple. Japanese shipyards used traditional construction methods: riveted hulls, sequential construction, skilled craftsmen. A Japanese shipyard could build a cargo ship in 6 to 9 months. An American shipyard could build one in 2 weeks. The mathematics were brutal. One Japanese shipyard could produce maybe 8 ships per year. One American slipway at Richmond could produce 26 ships per year. Richmond had 7 slipways. The math was not close. But the real killer was not just construction speed. It was labor efficiency. Building a riveted ship required skilled workers: riveters, boilermakers, ship fitters, marine electricians, pipe fitters. These were trades that took years to learn. Japan had perhaps 50,000 skilled shipyard workers in 1941. That number grew slowly during the war, but training new shipbuilders took time. You could not just hand someone a rivet gun and expect quality work. The learning curve was measured in years. The United States had perhaps 75,000 skilled shipyard workers in 1941. By 1943, American yards employed over 700,000 workers. By 1944, that number exceeded 1 million. How do you train 925,000 new shipbuilders in 3 years? You do not. You change the process so training is unnecessary. Welding could be taught in weeks. Prefabrication meant workers could specialize in a single repetitive task. Margaret Hayes spent 8 months welding hull seams and nothing else. She became incredibly efficient at that one task, but she could not build an entire ship. She did not need to. The assembly line broke shipbuilding into hundreds of small tasks. Each task could be learned quickly. Each worker became expert at their specific job. The ship emerged from the coordinated effort of hundreds of specialists, none of whom needed to understand the entire process. This was revolutionary. For thousands of years, building a ship required master craftsmen who understood every aspect of the vessel. The industrial assembly line destroyed that requirement. Margaret Hayes did not need to know how to install an engine or run electrical cable or build a deckhouse. She just needed to know how to weld a seam. And she was very, very good at welding seams. Japan could not replicate this system. Japanese industry in the 1940s was organized around skilled craftsmen and traditional methods. Japanese culture emphasized mastery and expertise. The idea of building a ship with semi-skilled workers using simplified processes was alien to Japanese industrial thinking. Japanese ships were also more complex. Japanese naval architects designed cargo ships with better performance characteristics than Liberty ships. Faster, more fuel-efficient, better handling. But better performance required more complex construction. More complex construction required more skilled workers and more time. The Liberty ship was deliberately simple. It was slow, 11 knots maximum speed. It was inefficient, burning more fuel per ton of cargo than a well-designed ship. It handled poorly in rough seas. But it was cheap and fast to build, and in a war of attrition, cheap and fast beat quality and performance. The United States was building ships faster than Germany, and Japan combined could sink them. By mid-1943, the math had reversed. American shipyards were delivering more tonnage per month than U-boats, and Japanese submarines were sinking. The Allies were winning the shipping war. By 1944, the U-boat threat was effectively neutralized. Improved convoy tactics, better anti-submarine warfare, air cover, and most importantly, an inexhaustible supply of replacement ships meant U-boats could no longer threaten Allied supply lines. In the Pacific, Japan was strangling. By late 1944, American submarines had sunk so much Japanese merchant shipping that Japan could no longer supply its military forces. Troops on Pacific islands were starving. Fuel shipments to Japan dropped by 75%. Raw materials for factories stopped arriving. Japan's economy was collapsing not because of strategic bombing, but because the merchant fleet was gone. By August 1945, Japan had less than 1 million tons of functional merchant shipping remaining. They had started the war with 6 million tons. American submarines had sunk over 5 million tons, and Japanese shipyards had managed to build only about 2.5 million tons of replacement vessels over 4 years. The United States built 50,200 merchant ships during World War II. Total tonnage exceeded 50 million tons. Japan built approximately 700 merchant ships during the same period. Total tonnage was under 4 million tons. The Americans built more merchant shipping in 4 years than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. This was not a fair fight. This was industrial annihilation. And it was made possible by women like Margaret Hayes. At the peak of Liberty ship production in 1943, women made up 27% of the workforce at Kaiser Shipyards. That number seems low until you realize that in 1940, women made up less than 2% of shipyard workers. Going from 2% to 27% in 3 years represented a social revolution happening in real time. The women were called Rosie the Riveters, even though most of them were welders, not riveters. The name came from a propaganda poster and a popular song. The image was a woman in work clothes flexing her arm with the caption, "We can do it." The poster became iconic, but the reality was more complicated. The women who worked in the shipyards were not there because of patriotic inspiration. Most of them were there because they needed money. Margaret Hayes was making $38 per week as a schoolteacher in Iowa. At the Richmond shipyard, she made $1.20 per hour, which worked out to $48 per week for a 40-hour week. With overtime, which was constant, she was making $70 to $80 per week. That was more than twice her teaching salary. The money was life-changing. Margaret sent half her paycheck home to her parents in Iowa. Her father had lost his farm in 1938. The money Margaret sent kept her family fed and housed. She was not building ships to defeat fascism. She was building ships to save her family. But the effect was the same. The women who came to the shipyards came for economic reasons, but they stayed because the work was meaningful. Margaret described it in a letter to her sister in July 1943. She wrote, "I know what I am building. Every ship I work on will carry food to Britain, or ammunition to the Pacific, or troops to Europe. If I do my job right, those men will make it across the ocean. If I do my job wrong, they will drown. That knowledge makes every weld important. I am not just making money. I am saving lives." The women faced constant discrimination. Male workers resented their presence. Supervisors doubted their capabilities. The unions tried to keep them out. When Margaret first arrived at Richmond, her supervisor assigned her to the paint shop. Painting was considered women's work. Margaret refused. She had been trained as a welder, and she wanted to weld. The supervisor told her welding was men's work, and women did not have the strength or skill to do it properly. Margaret asked for a welding test. The supervisor reluctantly agreed, assuming she would fail. Margaret welded a test seam. The inspector examined it and declared it acceptable. The supervisor had no choice but to assign her to a welding crew. But he placed her on the least important work, welding interior braces that no one would ever see. Margaret welded interior braces for 2 weeks, then asked to be moved to hull work. The supervisor refused. Margaret went over his head to the yard superintendent. She pointed out that her welds had passed every inspection and asked why she was being restricted to non-critical work. The superintendent, under pressure to increase production, overruled the supervisor. Margaret was assigned to hull welding. Within a month, she was one of the fastest welders on her crew. Within 3 months, she was training new workers. By the end of 1942, Margaret was a lead welder supervising a crew of 8 workers, 5 of whom were men. The men did not like taking orders from a woman. 2 of them refused and requested transfers. The yard superintendent denied the transfers and told the men they could work under Margaret's supervision or find jobs elsewhere. Both men stayed. One of them eventually apologized. The other never spoke to Margaret except when necessary for work. Margaret did not care. She was there to build ships, not make friends. The social changes happening in the shipyards were unprecedented. Women were doing jobs that had been exclusively male for centuries. They were earning wages comparable to men. They were supervising male workers. They were proving that gender was irrelevant to capability. The changes were temporary. Everyone knew that. When the war ended, the women would be expected to go home, give up their jobs, return to traditional roles. But for 3 or 4 years, the rules were suspended. Women were welders and electricians and crane operators and supervisors. They were doing impossible things and getting paid for it. Margaret loved the work. She loved the physicality of it, the skill required, the immediate feedback. When you welded a seam correctly, you could see it. The metal flowed smoothly, the bead was consistent, the joint was strong. When you welded it poorly, that was obvious too. There was no ambiguity, no subjectivity. Good work was good work. Margaret also loved the scale. As a teacher, she had helped individual students learn individual lessons. Important work, but small. In the shipyard, she was building machines that weighed 14,000 tons and would change the course of history. Every ship she worked on would carry thousands of tons of cargo across oceans. Those cargoes would feed armies, supply factories, sustain nations. The scale was intoxicating. In September 1943, Margaret was promoted to welding inspector. Her job was to examine welds made by other workers and determine if they met quality standards. She had authority to reject work and require it to be redone. Rejecting work was unpopular. Workers did not get paid for redoing rejected welds. If Margaret rejected a seam, the welder had to grind it out and redo it on their own time. Margaret was rigorous. She rejected welds that other inspectors would have passed. Her rejection rate was twice the yard average. Workers complained. Supervisors pressured her to be more lenient. Production targets were being missed because Margaret was rejecting too much work. Margaret refused to lower her standards. She told her supervisor that every weld she approved could mean the difference between a ship making it home or sinking in the North Atlantic. She was not going to approve substandard work because someone wanted to hit a production quota. The supervisor threatened to demote her. Margaret said she would go to the yard superintendent and explain that she was being pressured to approve defective welds. The superintendent would have to choose between production targets and ship safety. The supervisor backed down. Margaret kept her job and her standards. In November 1943, a Liberty ship named the SS Schenectady broke in half while docked in Portland, Oregon. The ship had been launched in September. It was tied to a pier, fully loaded with cargo, when the hull suddenly cracked amidships and the entire vessel split into two pieces. No one was killed, but the incident was a disaster for the Liberty ship program. The newspapers called it proof that welded ships were defective. The Navy launched an investigation. Engineers examined the wreckage and determined that the failure was caused by brittle fracture, a phenomenon where steel cracks suddenly under stress at cold temperatures. The specific cause was a combination of poor quality steel, inadequate welding, and design flaws in the way stress was distributed through the hull. The investigation found that approximately 15% of Liberty ships had similar defects. Some ships had already experienced cracks. 3 ships had broken in half at sea. Crews had died. The Liberty ship program was in crisis. If the ships were defective, the entire production effort was wasted. Worse, if ships were sinking because of construction flaws rather than enemy action, the workers who built them were responsible for American deaths. Margaret read the investigation report and felt sick. She had welded seams on over 40 ships. If those ships were defective, if men had died because of her work, she did not know if she could continue. The shipyards implemented immediate changes, new welding procedures, better steel, design modifications to reduce stress concentrations. Workers received additional training. Inspection standards were tightened. Margaret's rigorous rejection rate, which had been criticized, was now held up as the example everyone should follow. The fixes worked. After the design changes, no more Liberty ships broke in half. The existing ships were inspected and reinforced where necessary. The program continued, but Margaret never forgot the Schenectady. For the rest of her life, she wondered if any of the welds she had made had contributed to the failures. She never knew. The records did not track individual welders to specific seams on specific ships, but the possibility haunted her. By 1944, the shipping war was won. The United States was producing cargo vessels faster than they could be sunk. The invasion of Europe was possible only because hundreds of Liberty ships were available to carry troops and supplies across the Atlantic. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, over 130 Liberty ships participated in the invasion. They carried tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, everything an army needed to fight. Without those ships, without the workers who built them, D-Day would have been impossible. In the Pacific, Liberty ships supplied the island-hopping campaign. Every invasion required hundreds of ships to carry troops and supplies across thousands of miles of ocean. Japan could not compete. Japanese logistics were collapsing while American logistics were just getting started. By late 1944, the demand for new merchant ships was declining. The existing fleet was large enough to meet current needs. Shipyards started closing. Workers were laid off. Margaret received her layoff notice in November 1944. The Richmond shipyards were reducing production. Her welding crew was being eliminated. She had 2 weeks. Margaret had been working at Richmond for 2 years and 8 months. She had worked on 63 ships. She had welded thousands of seams. She had trained dozens of workers. And now it was over. She was not surprised. Everyone knew the war was ending. Everyone knew the women would be the first to lose their jobs. The men returning from military service would need employment, and they would get priority. That was understood. Margaret collected her final paycheck on November 30th, 1944. She had saved over $4,000 during her time at Richmond. That money would be enough to buy a house. She took the train back to Iowa. Her plan was to return to teaching. The school district was happy to rehire her. She started teaching again in January 1945. Same school, same salary she had left in 1942. $38 per week. Margaret taught for 3 more years, then married a farmer and stopped working outside the home. She raised 4 children. She never welded again. She rarely talked about the shipyards. When her children asked what she did during the war, she said she worked in a factory. She did not mention the ships or the welding or the fact that she had been part of the largest industrial mobilization in human history. In the 1970s, a historian researching the Liberty Ship program found Margaret's name in the Richmond shipyard employment records. The historian contacted her and asked if she would be willing to be interviewed. Margaret agreed. The interview was conducted in 1976. Margaret was 62 years old. She had not thought about the shipyards in decades. The historian asked her what it was like to work at Richmond. Margaret said it was the hardest work she had ever done, and the most important. She said she was proud of what she had accomplished, but also sad that it had been forgotten. The historian asked if she felt that women had proven themselves capable of doing men's work. Margaret said the question was wrong. It was not men's work or women's work. It was work that needed to be done, and women had done it. The fact that it had previously been done by men was irrelevant. Capability was not gendered. The historian asked if the experience had changed her life. Margaret said yes, but not in the way people might expect. The experience had shown her that she was capable of more than she had believed. She had thought of herself as a small-town schoolteacher with limited options. The shipyard showed her she could do difficult, skilled, important work, but after the war, those options disappeared. She went back to teaching, then to being a farm wife and mother. Those were good roles, important roles, but they were not what she had chosen. They were what was available. Margaret died in 1998 at the age of 84. Her obituary mentioned that she had worked in a wartime factory, but did not specify which factory or what she had done. Her children did not know the details. The interview she gave in 1976 was archived at a university library and forgotten. The Liberty Ship program built 2,710 ships between 1941 and 1945. Those ships carried 75% of all cargo shipped overseas during World War II. They carried tanks and trucks and artillery and ammunition and food and fuel and mail and medicine and everything else an army needed. Without the Liberty ships, the United States could not have fought a two-ocean war. Without workers like Margaret Hayes, the Liberty ships would not have existed. Japan built 720 merchant ships during World War II. They started with a larger merchant fleet than the United States, better designed ships, and more experienced shipyard workers. But they lost the Industrial War because they could not scale production. They were building ships the old way, and the old way was too slow. The United States built ships the new way. Prefabrication, assembly lines, welding, semi-skilled labor, women workers, around-the-clock production. It was loud and chaotic, and sometimes dangerous, but it worked. Margaret Hayes and the millions of other Rosie the Riveters did not just build ships. They built the industrial capacity that won the war. They proved that gender was not a barrier to capability. They showed that traditional methods could be overthrown when necessity demanded. They demonstrated that ordinary people, given training and opportunity, could accomplish extraordinary things. And then they were forgotten. The men came home from the war and took the jobs. The women went home and raised families. The shipyards closed. The Liberty ships were sold for scrap or sunk as breakwaters or converted to other uses. A few were preserved as museum ships. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien is docked in San Francisco. The SS John W. Brown is in Baltimore. You can tour them, walk through the cargo holds, see the engine room, stand on the deck. But you cannot see the Welds. The Welds are hidden under paint and rust. You cannot see Margaret Hayes' work. You cannot see the 847 seams she welded on the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days in November 1942. Those welds are invisible. And so is she. If this story moved you, if you think Margaret Hayes and the other Rosie the Riveters deserve to be remembered, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. These women built the machines that won the war, and then history erased them. Let's change that. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Real people, real heroism, real history that deserves to be told. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, somewhere else? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family worked in the war industries. Tell us if you have heard of the Liberty ships. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Margaret Hayes and the millions of women like her do not disappear into silence. These women deserve to be remembered. You are helping make that happen.